Amazing Grace, the favorite hymn of Dr. H. Orton Wiley, renowned educator and theologian of the Church of the Nazarene. Here is Dr. Wiley in his study, visiting with Dr. Paul T. Culbertson.
Dr. Wiley, where were you born?
I was born in Marquette, Nebraska, about halfway between Central City and Aurora.
And that was in what year?
1877, November the 15th.
I think I remember hearing you or reading some comments made by you in one of your sermons in your book, God Has the Answer, about the fact that you were reared, I believe, in a sod house. Is that true?
Yes, I was born in a sod house and lived in a sod house till I was between 4 and 5 years old.
How old were you when your family, or when you came to the far west, to California?
I was 8 years old, and I was 9, I think, just a little later. We came in the spring.
You located where in California?
Tulare.
Tulare County, up in the San Joaquin
Tulare
Valley.
City, Tulare County.
I remember that you lived for a time in Oregon. When did you go to Oregon?
We went to Oregon in 1893.
You attended school there, didn't you?
Yes, I attended Medford High School. Went in 93 and 94, and then graduated in 95.
And then attended the Southern Oregon, what is now the Southern Oregon School of Education.
Yes, it was the Southern Oregon Normal then. I graduated there in 1898.
Wasn't it during this time that you worked as a druggist?
Yes, I worked in Strang's drugstore while I was in the high school.
You were actually a licensed pharmacist during those years.
Well, I was studying for the certificate, so I had an assistant pharmacist certificate, took my examination in Portland. Then the next year I was granted a full certificate.
When did you return to California?
I came back in 1901. Came down in Christmas 1900, and I started into university in 1901, the second semester.
That was in Berkeley, California.
Berkeley, California.
You were converted when you were in Oregon, were you not?
Yes, Medford, Oregon.
And when did you first really feel a call to the ministry?
Well, while I was working in the drugstore, it kept growing on me all the time, so I dropped out of the drugstore and came down and started in university.
Did you come from a family of ministers? Had there been prominent ministers in your family?
My grandfather was a United Brethren minister.
And his name was?
Ward, J.W. Ward.
J.W. Ward. Well, that's very interesting. And you attended the university then, and were you preparing for the ministry,
Yes.
basically? When did you serve your first pastorate in the church, or in the United Brethren Church at first, was it not?
Yes, my first pastorate was at Gridley. I had 3 appointments, Gridley, Live Oak, and Bangor up back in the hills.
Do you remember anything particular that happened during those earliest pastorates that is of interest to us?
I remember my first sermon.
Tell us about that.
Well, I had never preached. I'd been president of the Young People's Society in the United Brethren Church, but I'd never preached. But I had the idea, gotten, I suppose, from the holiness people about it didn't need much preparation, but I was a little worried about that, and so I had 2 sermons prepared. They didn't expect a preacher and wasn't looking for one. They had rented the parsonage, and it seemed to me as if it was a rather cool reception. But I took hold of the service, and I preached in the morning, used all my sermon material up, looked at my watch. I'd talked just 5 minutes. The next thing I did was to swing over, gracefully or otherwise, to my evening sermon, took my text and preached all of that, and looked at my watch, and I'd preached just 10 minutes, or just 5 minutes more, 10 minutes altogether.
Seems to me like I've read somewhere, I've forgotten, about Dr. Brzez's first sermon. It seems to me like he had a similar experience.
Yes, he preached all the way from Genesis to Revelation.
Now, when did you actually become actively associated with the Nazarenes? When did you
Well,
begin attending?
I became associated with them while I was in the university, and I attended the Oakland church there.
Yes.
And my father had a grocery store, and I did a lot of the delivering, drove a delivery wagon all over there. And we had a family by the name of House that dealt with us in the store. And they were trying to build up a Sunday school, and a young lady asked my father if they had any young people in the family. He said yes, he had a young man, a young woman. So she asked me to have them come out to Sunday school. So they laughed at me about it, but I went out to Sunday school. Happened to be Alice House.
And she subsequently became Mrs.
Yes.
Wiley.
But then we went into the ministry, the United Brethren ministry, after that, because
Yes.
there wasn't any churches then, you know, in the Church of Nazarene.
Now, when did you join the Church of the Nazarene, and when were you ordained? Were you ordained by Dr. Brzee?
Yeah.
When was that?
Well, in 1906, I supplied the church there in 1905, and then I was called to the assistantship of Dr. Bell in the United Brethren Church, and so Brother Chafee decided finally not to come, so after I'd moved down to Oakland, stayed one Sunday, I moved back, and they called me back. I took charge of the church there
In Berkeley.
in Berkeley.
And that was...
Associate pastor with Brother Gervin.
You spent just one day as associate, or one Sunday with
one
the associate
Sunday.
pastor in the United Brethren Church at Oakland.
Yeah.
Well, that was a rather short ministry. Now, tell me a little bit about your further education and preparation for joining the forces here in connection with Pasadena University, or Nazarene University as it was called.
While I was on the Esparta circuit, they changed district superintendents, or presiding elders, they called them then.
Yes.
And this new presiding elder was there, talked with me and told me at that time that the best thing for me to do would be, if I could at all do it, was to go to seminary.
Yes.
And so I made arrangements to go down to Berkeley Seminary. It was the Berkeley Theological Seminary then, the Pacific Theological Seminary. So I came down, moved down, and then traveled back and forth to Esparto every week, and started on the seminary in 1905.
Now, you came then to the South in 1910, was it?
Yes. At that camp meeting, Dr. Brzee was there, and Fred Everson, and so on. And I had just graduated in the seminary and so on, and so they wanted me to come down. And
That was the old Beulah Park camp
That's
meeting.
the old Beulah Park, yes,
Yes.
over in East Oakland. And then I came down, and of course Snyder and I made the first catalog. And then I went back and moved down on the first day of August.
That was the year in which the Nazarene University was moved from Hollywood to the Pasadena campus.
And moved from the 28th Street Bible.
Oh, I
College.
see. Yes, the 28th Street.
The Hollywood campus was sold for this property, Hughes Ranch.
Yes. Now, Dr. Brzee was then considered president of Nazarene University, was he not?
He was president of the university and president of the board of trustees.
Yes.
And they talked it over and wanted me to organize the College of Liberal Arts and made me dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Dr. Dallin was college of the East Pacific Bible College, and of course Snyder had the academy.
Yes.
The three of us, and then they made me vice president to have charge.
Now, Dr. Brzee retired from the presidency in what year? That-
Well, they elected Dr. Ellison in 1911. I was here in 10 and 11. And then they elected Dr. Ellison in 11. And Dr. Brzee resigned, and they had quite a inauguration service for Dr. Ellison on the front porch of what's now the West Dorm.
Now, you were elected president to succeed Dr. Ellison in what year?
13.
1913. It seems to me that you told me one day about the fact that Dr. Ellison had been elected president, I believe, of another college, hadn't he?
Olivet.
Olivet Nazarene College, and that the two of you, in adjacent rooms, worked out the catalogs for these two institutions.
He worked out the catalog for all of it, and I worked out the one for Pasadena just through the door there.
Well, no doubt these two catalogs were somewhat alike.
No.
They weren't?
We never saw one, either one.
Oh, is that so?
I never showed them mine. They never showed me theirs.
Dr. Ellison was here then for a period of about
2 years.
About 2 years. Mm-hmm. I see.
And so when he came, several came from the Open Isle. And so we had our first class that graduated in 12. And then he graduated the next class in 13.
Yes.
Now
your first presidency was from 1913 to 1916, was it?
Yes, 1916.
And then you returned to Berkeley to continue.
Berkeley as pastor. And while there, they called me up to the Idaho Holiness School it was then.
I see. And it is now?
Northwest Nazarene College.
Yes. You were there for how long?
10 years.
What kind of a period was that in your life?
It was certainly strenuous. We had no equipment much, and the location didn't seem to be just right in the eyes of the Northwest District. There's only one district then, the Great Northwest District, and it was rather hard going, financially and otherwise. But we lived through it, got lots of experience.
The hard way.
Yeah.
Well, what about that incident about the coal? I remember hearing you tell about that.
Well, I came down across the corner of the campus one day, and the clouds were up in the west, and I knew we were going to have a snowstorm, and I knew we only had a half a ton of coal in the bunkers, and that it took a ton a day to keep us going. Sometimes, we had to take all those pipes out and thaw them out in the heating plant and
Yes.
put them back. And I had my head down, and I was saying to myself, I wonder why it is that holiness schools are sending out missionaries and preachers and so on, yet they're always on the ragged edges of things financially. And I just couldn't understand it. And the Lord seemed to whisper to me and say that the trial of your faith, being more precious than gold, though it be tried with fire. I got my head up and went into the office, cold, didn't have any heat much. And the telephone bell rang, and they said, did you order a carload of coal? And I said, no, we didn't. And he said, somebody did, and we can't find out who did it. He said, would you like to have it? I said, well, I'd like to, but we don't have any money. Oh, he said, your credit's good. I said, send it out. And the roads were so muddy in those days, they didn't have any paving, that they sent it out in carts, 2-horse carts.
Yes.
And they came down the muddy road and drove on the north side of the campus and got up to the bunkers. And I sat there and listened to that coal rolling in the bunkers. And I think it's one of the greatest blessings I ever had hearing that coal going to those bunkers that day.
Well, I'm sure it must have been a wonderful experience, though a difficult one.
Yeah.
Now, you were 10 years at Napa, and then you returned to Pasadena,
Yes.
as I recall. What year was that?
I came back in 1926. I closed the commencement up there, and then came down in 20.
You remained how long?
Here?
The second time.
Oh, yes. Well, I was president 3 years, but I went back to Kansas City and they elected me editor in 1928. So I had to give up and went back there.
This period in 1926 to 29 was a period when you were very definitely concerned with financial problems here at Pasadena,
Yes,
as I recall.
and many others.
You spent then how many years as editor of the Herald of Holiness?
I was actually editor for 8 years, 2 full terms. But I moved back there in 29, and then I moved back here in 33. And I edited the Herald of Holiness for from August till January from my office up here.
Well,
And
in Pasadena.
then I submitted my resignation to the Board of Superintendents at the annual meeting, and they accepted it, and so I was free from it then.
What impressions do you have as you think back upon your experience as editor?
Well, You don't know how much you're doing or what you're doing or if you're doing anything unless you make a mistake, and then you find it out in a hurry. But I rather enjoyed my work. Of course, I tried to make the Herald a little more of a journal than a newspaper, but I think Dr. White has done well in making it a newspaper. But I served up till 33, and then they asked me to continue as editor and write the editorials. And they put in Dr. Shelby Corlett as office editor.
Yes. Now you returned to Pasadena College for the third time as president in 1933 and remained there until 1948, was it not?
Yes, well, it closed at 48 and 49.
I think the most perhaps significant event during those years was the liquidation of the debt on the administration building and accreditation.
We had the liquidation of the debt, though, in 1926, too, when it's turned over there.
That is right.
There was only just a few scattering things. The debt was raised. Yes, we had our accreditation. I think that Dr. Pergeiser, yourself, if I recall, went up to carry the thing through.
Well, it was a privilege to be associated with you in those years when we were securing accreditation. Now let's think of some of the outstanding personalities with whom you've been associated over these many years, and especially in the earlier years. Obviously, you were very close to Dr. Phineas Franklin Bresee, the founder of the Church of the Nazarene. As I recall now, he was converted as a boy, young man in New York State, and then sanctified during his ministry in Iowa as a pioneer Methodist preacher. Then in, I believe it was 1883, he came to Southern California. He became pastor of the leading Methodist church in this area, as I recall. What church was that?
That was the, what was called the 4th Street Church then. It's what is First Church now. And he was asked to preach for them, and so at the next conference they elected him as pastor there. He came to Pasadena, and they had just built a church here, but it was too small. So he had a tabernacle built right alongside of it.
Well,
Seats quite a little. I think it's between 2,000 and 3,000 somewhere there. And he preached in that tabernacle, and he had it full. But of course, he was always for prohibition and against vice of any kind. And he preached a sermon. They called his rhinoceros sermon, you know. And they burned him in effigy one time in the park down here in Pasadena.
Well, that's very interesting. I remember that sermon that there was a move on to repeal local option, I think, and someone said that the sermon was hot enough to pierce a rhinoceros's hide.
Yeah.
Well, he was a great believer, not only in heart holiness, but in holiness applied to the social problems of the day.
And he knew how to strike where it hurt, too.
Yes.
You know the expression, don't you, he used?
No, I don't think I do.
Well, he used this expression: anybody that would sell liquor and ruin families would sell his own daughter into prostitution.
Well, that must have been the
That
key sentence in that sermon.
That is the key sentence in there, and they.
Well, this fusion of concern for holiness of heart and holiness in society, if we might put it that way, eradication of social evil, and concern for the poor, these seem to me to be a most helpful combination of values and of objectives.
His liking for ministry to the poor people is really the source of our church in a way, you know.
Yes.
That's the reason we call it the Church of the Nazarene.
I see.
A lot of folks yet think, asking whether anything good could come out of Nazareth.
I see. Well, I didn't realize that, and but I do see the connection.
Yeah, that is the connection. Dr. Whitney gave it the term.
Yes. Now, as I recall, one of the reasons for the increasing opposition to Dr. Bresee in the Methodist Church was the fact that he brought to this area many early holiness evangelists.
Dr. Bresee was superintendent then, and he had meetings in various places.
Oh, yes.
And Brother Gay used to tell us that in one church, I've forgotten which church it was now, that the evangelists were preaching, and had been preaching holiness, and hadn't been much of a move. So that Dr. Brzee, after the preaching was through, got up on the altar and talked to him, and laid it down for the straight. He said, now, if what these people are preaching is true, you folks need the experience. If it isn't, well, then we don't need the preachers. And when he got through with them, it just broke up everywhere, you know.
Think of that.
And Brother Gay said that's where the Church of the Nazarene was born.
Don't you think that probably there are many holiness preachers who preach holiness without much opposition, and who possibly need a greater degree of positiveness and of urgency in the matter that will arouse opposition and get people sanctified?
Yes. We used to have a saying that when they preached holiness, we'd ask the question, do they preach it sincerely enough and definitely enough so they could call an altar service for it?
Yes.
That
seemed to be true in Dr. Brzee's ministry.
Yeah, it was true.
As I understand it.
They were either all for him or all against him.
Well, I find that frequently in the earlier messages of Dr. Brzee. Now, I'm interested also in some of the other characteristics of his personality. It seemed to me he was an unusually interesting and admirable type of individual. For example, his optimism.
He always said we're in the morning of our existence, and the sun never sets in the morning. We haven't reached our zenith. Those are great expressions of his all the time.
Seemed to me like I've heard somewhere is it true that he always said good morning to people?
Yes. He'd meet people any time of the day and night, and there's always good morning. People look at him strangely.
Then this concern that he had for the underprivileged, the poor, the people who did not have all the advantages of others. This was an enduring feature of his
all the way through
interest, wasn't it?
He wanted to preach to poor people, and he never have any reserved seats. And he always got the people that are hard of hearing right up inside the altar.
Well,
and
I remember in one of his messages, he said that we want our churches so plain that the poorest individual will feel welcome, and if he can get here on time, he'll get a front seat. I think times have changed, haven't they, a little bit there?
Yeah. They used to get the front seats.
But he was against the expenditure of great funds for elaborate equipment, as I understood it, at least in those days.
Yes, he was. But still, he didn't want any just sheds, you know.
Yes.
Oh, First Church was a nice church.
Well, that's of interest.
Street.
Yes. Another feature of his ministry that interested me was his friendliness. Someone was telling me about his arrival early at church on Sunday morning to greet the people.
He always stood at the door and greeted the people as they came in. He never went to the back of the church after service.
What was his thinking at that particular point, do you think?
Well, he wanted to greet them, have them come in and get acquainted with them. But he used to kind of laugh and say, he said, after I got through preaching, I didn't feel like meeting anybody.
I see. How would you characterize Dr. Brzee as a leader? What are your major impressions about him?
Well, he was just naturally a leader. You didn't have to be with him only a few minutes to see that.
Yes.
But then he was quite reserved. He never pushed himself forward or anything like that. The fact is, he wouldn't preach unless they kind of begged him to.
Well.
And he was wonderfully efficient as a presiding officer. He knew he was a parliamentarian from the word up before it go.
He's a very persistent man, as I recall from one of your accounts.
I was secretary with him in the Northern California. It's a San Francisco district then, as you know. And we were coming up, just finishing up. And it came up time for noon, and Brother Liningworth, the district superintendent, said, now let's don't, we only just a little more to do here, and let's finish up. Then we'd have the afternoon meeting in the evening. But they talk more, it seemed, in those days than they do now, and so they got off on various things. And then Brother Liningworth said, well, I didn't know it was going to take so long. I think we better adjourn. And Dr. Brzee said, no, I wanted to adjourn a while ago, and you wouldn't let me, and I was going to stay here till we get through. So I sat on one side of the table from 8 o'clock in the morning till 4 o'clock in the afternoon without getting up, while he sat on the opposite side of the table. We got through at 4 o'clock that afternoon, missed the afternoon session.
I think somewhere I've read about the fact that if he were looking for a house and happened to pass it, he'd go clear around the block rather than go back.
That's when he's driving a horse and buggy. If he missed the number, he'd always say, "Oh, it's just in there around the block." He never liked to turn back.
I think that's quite indicative of his wonderful
that was indicative of his
persistence.
His persistence. It was a little difficult for me to get acquainted with Dr. Brzee because he was all self-effacing, you know. He'd come out and say, "Now, I don't know whether I ought to speak today or not." And, of course, I was always used to taking orders from a superior being, and I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to contradict him. I soon learned, though. I said, "Oh, no, doctor, they're expecting you here, and everything's all in order." Well, they said, "All right, then." That's the way he always did, though. But he wouldn't push himself out. They wanted him to preach. They had to make it pretty plain that they wanted him. The sermon he preached, one of the greatest sermons he preached, was at the 1907 Chicago. That's when the East and West met.
Yes.
Everything just broke to pieces all the way through. He began to climb.
He liked response.
Had to have it. Didn't have a response, right? He'd wonder what was the matter with it. Surely would. And he was used to it. And he never liked to have a break in a meeting.
That is the most interesting thing. Tell me a little bit about his practice of singing after prayer, for example.
Yes, well, that happened, of course, when he was in the Methodist Church, and they had a habit of getting up in prayer and then turning a songbook and finding a song and starting in. He never liked a break. Everything had to move straight through. And so he started to sing his songs. He couldn't sing, you know, he couldn't strike a tune.
I see.
But the folks soon caught on, and they'd cover him up, you know, and start to sing. The same thing was true with prayer, though. When he got down and asked somebody to lead in prayer, he expected the folks to lead in prayer. And not a break anywhere.
Seems to me like you told me about one incident. Tell that one, won't you?
Yeah, that was over here in the chapel. And perhaps the people didn't understand him, but I'd had that experience before in Berkeley, so I knew what was coming. But he said, "Someone lead in prayer." Now, whether they understood him or not, I don't know, but nobody led. And so he started in and prayed. And he waited a minute, and nobody prayed, and he started in and prayed again. Waited a minute, started in and prayed again. Waited another minute or so, and nobody prayed. He got up and prayed again. And he got up and he said, "What's the matter around here anyhow?" He said, "If any of you fellas want to pray, go on pray. I've prayed 4 times already."
Oh, that's real good. I remember in reading of his life the rather considerable shock of the accident that he suffered in August of 1900. Could you comment on that just a little bit?
It is. One lady was killed, you know, and they were injured, and his daughter-in-law, Ada, was injured. Before that, he had dark, almost black hair, you know, and wore a beard all the time.
I see.
But his hair and beard turned white, so he shaved the beard off, and then he was quite bald later, you know.
I remember that he was away from his pulpit for several weeks, actually 2 or 3 months, as I recall, and how the people stood and sang the doxology when he returned. And,
oh, yeah.
Well, there were many, many other wonderful leaders back in those earlier days. Tell me a little bit about your impressions of this general superintendent who was such a fine expositor.
Dr. Walker.
Dr. Walker, yes.
Dr. E.F. Walker. I have first heard of Dr. Walker in San Francisco. He was an evangelist then.
Yes.
And then he got in touch with the Nazarenes, and he joined the church here and was assistant pastor with Dr. Brzee at First Church, was elected superintendent at Nashville, as you recall. I think he really was one of the greatest expositors that I've ever listened to. rarely used many illustrations. But he'd preach for an hour or so, and just hold your attention all the way through. I was with him in the camp meeting in Stockton, and he took the text, "When he, the Spirit of truth, is come," and preached on throughout the whole camp and never repeated himself.
Think of that.
It is said that sometimes he'd go into a place and preach and go back 3 months later and pick the subject up and go right on it.
Well, he must have had a wonderful memory. Dr. Brzee had a fine memory, too.
Oh, Dr. Brzee had a fine memory, but they were entirely different. One was an expositor,
Yes.
and the other was an orator.
Seems to me like I've heard you tell about the arrival of 2 boys on the campus when you were here for the second presidency. Tell us about that, will you?
Oh, those were the 2 niece boys. They came out with their grips. One of them was very respectable, and the other was tied up with a rope. Came up the old Palm Drive and waited outside for me. Got to talk with him. Dr. Orban, especially, he always said that when he was waiting in the outer office, I was lining somebody up, a disciplinary person in the inner office. I don't know about that, but they were there and said.
Now this was Orville Niece and Floyd.
Floyd. Floyd was president of EMC, and Orville was president here.
Yes. Orville followed your second term here in 1929, wasn't it? That
Yes,
he was made
he took charge in 29 when I left.
acting president and then president.
For editor.
Yes. Among the other leaders of the early church, I often heard you mention Judge Knott and Reverend Lucy P. Knott. Would you comment a little bit on these 2 wonderful people?
Well, Lucy P. Knott was pastor of the Mateo Street Church, and then they moved. It was Emmanuel Church, and she had quite a church. And before she left First Church, she had what they call Company E. Had about 400 young women in that company.
Was that something like the beginning of the Nazarene Young People's Society?
Well, something like it, I suppose. Only that she just had the young women.
I see.
The other was the Brotherhood of St. Stephen, the young men.
I see.
But then she took that church out there. She was in a Mexican settlement where they disturbed her a good deal sometimes, but they'd have them arrested and take them up to court, and then she'd go up and plead for them and get them off.
Well, now, did both the young men and young women wear these so-called shiners that I have seen you wear? Tell me a little about that shiner. What was it?
Well, the shiner
exactly?
was the Maltese cross, and the church was out in companies, but Company E was the young ladies, young women's company, and Mr. Wiley had her pen for years. It had the same kind, but it had Company E on it.
I see.
But most of them just had the regular shiner. It was done for advertising reasons, for one thing, and as the people began to wear them, why people began to talk about how many people were wearing those.
Yes.
And then it was intended to be an approach to personal work. People would ask what that was, and so they'd quote it and then go on and talk religion to them.
Yes.
Oh, it served other purposes sometimes. A couple of the young men were coming down one dark street one night and were held up, and they didn't know what to do, and they flashed their shiners on. thought it was they were police and got out. One good old brother, he didn't know what it meant. Meant 1 Timothy 4:16, isn't it?
4:12.
4:12. 1 Timothy
Yes.
4:12. And he looked at it and he said, "Young man, 1 timber, 4/12." He said, "That's pretty good sized timber."
A very wonderful tribute is given by C.W. Ruth to Dr. Brzee. What do you recall about C.W. Ruth?
Well, I've known Brother C.W. Ruth ever since he held a meeting, I think, in 1901 for us in the Berkeley Church. And we just had a hall then, and I attended, got well acquainted with him. He was very effective as an evangelist. And his Bible readings that he'd give every morning or every afternoon would be very fine. And he was pastor, assistant with Dr. Brzee, and instrumental more than any other person, I think, in getting the different groups to come together.
That is on a nationwide basis.
On a nationwide basis. It was right after that meeting that Brother Ruth held in Berkeley, right after that time when I prayed through, we got clear in sanctification. So I've always kind of looked at him as a sort of a spiritual father.
Yes. Tell me a little bit about the relationship of Dr. Brzee to the outstanding leaders of the holiness movement who did not favor the organization of a separate denomination, like Dr. Fowler. I believe he was one who did not.
Well, the motive of our church is an organization of holiness people. Up to that time, the holiness people were scattered in various churches all the way through. So Dr. Brzee, when he started out to make a distinctive for the holiness church, why, of course, he met with disfavor on both sides, those that are opposed to holiness and those that wanted to stay in the old churches, and their motto was stay and pay and pray. And so Dr. Fowler gave those chair talks that were published in the paper, you know, and then they called Dr. Brzee back there to defend himself and defend his organization. Dr. Brzee told me before he left, he said, I don't want to go, but if I don't go, it'll be misunderstood. So he went. And when his time came to make his defense for organized holiness, he arose and addressed the chair. I count myself happy, O King Agrippa. He came back and told us all about it, word for word almost.
This meeting was held in Chicago?
I think it was in Chicago,
yes. Well,
I've heard Dr. Fowler preach. He was a great preacher, Dr. Fowler was. But
yes, I'm sure he was.
He and Dr. Joseph Smith and those folks, they were sincere, but they just thought that some way we could stay in and revive the old churches, but I don't know. I've never seen one revived yet.
Well, that's an interesting insight. What about outstanding students that you have had, especially in the earlier days? Are there some that stand out in your mind as outstanding young people on the campus and who later became leaders in the church, on the mission field, or in the superintendency of the church?
Yes, there's a lot of them stand out. There's Dr. Fred Shields. He graduated in 1911 from the Bible College and then stayed and went through college. And then he was elected, well, he taught with me in Nampa, and then he was elected president of ENC, and he moved the institution from its location to its present location in Wallace.
Oh, I see.
Dr. Fred Shields.
Yes. Seems like I've heard you tell about Esther Carson Winans when she was here on campus.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about her.
She was here, came in 1910, I believe it was, 1910. And I met her out at the corner of Lake and Washington. And we had an old, we called it the Ark, that drove back and forth to take students from the Lake and Washington over here. And I asked her if she's a student when coming to college. I said yes. I asked her what year she was in. She said she'd be a freshman. Then she turned around and asked me what year I was in.
You were then dean of the college.
Yeah.
Vice president of Nazarene University.
See,
How old were you?
I was 32.
Well, that's right. You were getting along.
So she was quite a character. She was a brilliant student, just one of those brilliant people. I sent her for McKee's one day, and she brought me the wrong ones, and I said, well, how did you get in? Oh, she said, don't ask me. I said, I know how you got in. You went through the transom. I said, Esther, if you don't quit that, you'll be climbing the buildings and sliding down the roofs. She just looked at me and said, you know, I do that at night.
It seemed to me I've heard you mention the fact that while she was a student, she disciplined herself for her service on the mission field. by the food that she ate and many other ways,
Oh, yes.
prepared herself to go.
She felt the call when she was converted at 4 years of age, and
that
felt the
so?
call to missions, and wanted to go, but her mother and father told her she wasn't quite old enough yet. And she never knew where she was going until she graduated. And she felt that was providential because she was interested in all the fields up to that time.
J.T. Hatfield was a leader in those days.
Yes.
Rather colorful.
He held meeting here too.
I remember seeing him once when I was just a boy. A very imposing looking individual with whiskers and
big feet. Had to have his shoes made especially.
Well, he was a big leader.
He used to get vehement, as he called it.
Yeah. You have seen a great many changes in this area over the years. What is your feeling with reference to does the church still have the enthusiasm and the fire, the pioneering spirit, do you think, that it had in those earlier days?
Well, I think I've always felt that the heart of the church is true and strong. I think we're living under very different conditions than we did then. We didn't have any prestige at all.
Yes.
We just had to go against everything, you know. And they used to call us this little sect around the corner. So small they thought, suppose it was an insect. But of course now we have some prestige, you see, and that kind of draws people to us. And I don't think perhaps that in many places that we have just the same degree of sacrifice perhaps we had in those days.
Well, I think that's one of the problems that we all face today, is the fact that with greater financial resources, with greater status in the community, and with a certain standing, even among other churches, this is a very, very significant problem that we all face in keeping that sacrificing and pioneering spirit. I think it's perhaps one of the main problems that we face.
The thing that was drilled into us was not how much we could get out of the church, but what we could put into it. And a real estate man one time tried to get Dr. Brzee to invest, and he said we could make a lot of money and open up. And Dr. Brzee looked at him and told him, he said, "No, I'm not in the church of Nazarene to make money out of it, but to put everything I've got into it." That always greatly impressed me.
Well, I remember, and my impression in reading Dr. Brzee's sermons, and that he tried to make the issues of holiness so sharp and so clear, so positive, that people who were half-hearted just wouldn't be interested and wouldn't make the effort even to attend.
No.
In fact, I remember in one of his sermons he mentions the fact that if you find it in your heart so that you could be content to attend a church close by your home and not come over to First Church, then by all means stay home. We're not interested in
I heard him say that a good many times. He said you ought to come far enough so you'd be glad to see each other when you got there. He believed in having a large church. He always said, you know, if you have a big fire, you can do a lot more if you have a lot of little ones.
That's interesting. This may not be a fair question, but I wonder, without having thought about this particularly, if you were counseling some young person who is beginning the Christian life, what are some of the guidelines or suggestions that you might offer in the way of developing a strong, useful Christian life?
I wrote a tract on that one time, and I lost it and forgot about it, and somebody sent me one, and I noticed it has been published in the Flame last month.
Is that so?
But I emphasize the need for actual Bible study, and I don't mean just external. I mean pondering over until the truth takes hold of us.
Yes.
And then I think that devotions must be, I think, regular as much as possible anyway, and take time for it. And then I've come to see that the church and the fellowship with the with the people of God is a tremendous factor in growth and grace.
Well, Dr. Wiley, it has been a wonderful privilege to interview you, to have you talk about these many things. I'm sure that many, many people will be blessed by your observations and insights, as you have been a blessing over the many years to countless numbers of people.
It has been suggested that we close this conversation with prayer. Let us bow our heads and look to the Lord and ask for His blessing upon this conversation which we've had one with another. And we pray, our Father, that Thy rich blessing may be upon our church. We've been going back over some of the records and some of the early days, some of the times of conflict, some of the times of discouragement, some of the times of hopeful uplook, other times of really distress. Now, as we've gone on down across the days and the years, and we've come to see something more of the mission that God has had it for us, we ask Thee that Thou wouldst give us the same courage and the same faith, the same daring, the same persistence that belong to the founders of this great work, and help us to keep that same spirit of joy, of optimism, of faith, and especially that we may grow in love one to another throughout all of our church. We believe in our church. It's meant so much to us in our lives. We know nothing else but the church, and we pray Thee that Thou wouldst keep Thy hand upon it for good down across the days. Bless those who have recorded this and made this recording. We ask Thee that in some way Thou wouldst put Thy blessing upon us. We desire to do nothing but what can be used of Thee in Thy service for the upbuilding of Thy people and their encouragement along the way. Now guide us and direct us, we pray Thee, in all things. Keep us by divine power, and when the time comes that Thou dost call us, may we indeed meet at the eastern gate to be with Thee forever and ever. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
May we accept this challenge of Dr. H. Orton Wiley, honored and revered by all for his life of service in both theology and Christian education. His writings are of lasting value, and his immortal influence will continue with us in years to come.